So to start, I'd like to just say thank you to John and the Kenyan Olympic Committee and to Dr. Pierce for introducing me to John, to give me the opportunity to speak with you today and meet with you today. Like John mentioned, I'm going to talk just a little bit about tapering and peaking. I think that really the reason why I have this sort of training and monitoring, I'm really using training and monitoring sort of as a frame to discuss just some basic ideas and concepts with tapering and peaking, and hopefully you'll find some of what I have in here a bit practical and applied in nature. So to steal a term or a quote from my coach and mentor, he would always say the first thing you need to understand about the training process is that it's a process. And so there's a book called Outliers that talks about the magical 10,000 hours, and it gives all these examples of how if you really want to achieve excellence, which that's the goal in sport, you need to be blessed with some genetic gifts. You need to be blessed with an opportunity, and you need to work really hard for a really long time. And I think that so in the book, it gives these different examples of people that have achieved excellence in different areas, whether it be music or math or technology or sport. And while the 10,000 hours isn't a magical amount of time, and there's been a bunch of good research that's in that area, that's not my area, I don't think anyone would doubt that if you want to be a really good athlete, you need to work really hard for a really long time. And I think what's unique about sport that's an important idea is that it's not as simple as just work as hard as you can as every single day, racking up 8 hours or more, because that's not how recovery and adaptation works. And so I think we need to be a bit more conscious of how we go about getting our hours in or getting our training in. And that really starts with a plan, and sort of a plan to navigate that process of training over the long haul. Sticking with that idea of training for a long period of time, and how it's not as simple as just the more you do, the better you get in a sort of a linear trajectory, is efficiency. And that's to say that if you have two different training programs, and let's say hypothetically, just for the sake of example, they both lead to the exact same result. So if it's whatever pick whatever adaptations you're chasing, pick whatever performance markers we might choose. If they both lead to the same result, but one took, let's say, half the amount of work, I would say that the one that required the less work was the better program. And I think from a more strength and conditioning lens, this is really important, as it allows us to better integrate with the sport. So I'm a weightlifting coach, and lifting weights is the sport. But for many of you guys, you're having training outside of the sport, and then you also have to train the sport. And then the other, I think, important general concept for the training process is timing. And this is a really good example of something related to tapering and peaking, but it's not just relevant to tapering and peaking. And that is that, if we often do training studies where we look at, okay, if we these longitudinal studies, we do a certain type of training program, and we measure things along the way to see what changes in the person's are brought about. And while that is helpful, we know as coaches that it's not just do we improve certain things, it's when do we improve them, how do we improve them, and how do we allow athletes to, how do we help them best express their adaptations when it most matters. So big competition, for example. And so I like to boil down the training process as a two-part process. We first, in our, if you want to call it accumulation and transmutation phases, or if you want to call it general preparation, specific preparation, we build the engine, right? We look at adaptations that we're trying to develop that by improving those adaptations, we help make the athlete better at the sport. But then at the same time, when we're doing that, we might impede their ability to express certain adaptations and their overall performance because of the training that they're doing at that time. And I think that it's important to have that sort of context in mind when we read training studies and go through some of the literature. This is something that I tell my students all the time. I sort of start with this when talking about training, and that is that it's important to differentiate periodization and what I'll mention next, programming. And I always say, start with the periodization model. So the periodization model is this blueprint for training. It's a conceptual framework. It's a philosophical paradigm in which we plan out our phases over time. And that's really all periodization is. It's timelines and phases. And, we can have larger phases and sub phases and even smaller phases within that. But start with the calendar. We build out our periodization plan. And then what we do is we fill that in with our programming. And so while periodization is timelines and phases, programming is the actual sets, reps, exercises, all of the actual contents of the training. And the programming is aimed at bringing about the desired goals and aims of the periodization. And so when we look at periodization, you don't give this to an athlete and say, do this workout, because there isn't exercises or sets and reps or intensities or any of that in the periodization. That is the programming. And I think it's so helpful when we start planning our large, let's say, annual plan or our macro cycle. Depends, sometimes we might have multiple macro cycles within an annual plan. In many of the sports I work with here at the university, often an annual plan is one macro cycle due to the nature of the academic calendar. But start with the periodization. I think it allows things to be much more meaningful when we put things together, and then attack the programming. I think especially younger coaches and a lot of my students, they want to start with, okay, what exercises am I going to have them do? What sets and reps am I going to have them do? That's part of the planning, but that should come after the periodization. So I mentioned the word macro cycle. Macro cycle lengths really depend on what the competition calendar and schedule looks like. It involves a preparatory period, both the general preparation and specific preparation, leading into a competition period, and how you might put together the training plan for the competition would depend on, is it a seasonal sort of team-based sport where we compete frequently and have games multiple times a week, once a week, what have you, for months? Or is it a sport where you have either a major competition or competitions, like, for example, maybe track and field, swimming, those types of sports? But like to give an example of, I mentioned annual plan is sometimes a macro cycle, sometimes within an annual plan we'll have multiple macro cycles. For the sport I work with, weightlifting, we typically have 2 to 3 competitions a year. And from one competition to the next, we'll do a macro cycle. And so thinking about tapering and peaking leads us to more focusing on the competition period. But I think it's worth mentioning that it's really difficult to talk about or to get sort of at some of the important stuff with tapering and peaking in the competition phase without also discussing the preparatory phase. And I think that, if you want a taper and peak to go really well, that so heavily relies on the preparation going really well. and I'll refer to that a couple times over the next couple minutes. But the very basic definition, and instead of reading the long one, I'll just mention, I'll just touch on the basic definition. Tapering, the idea of taper is pretty simple. We're going to reduce workloads. A book that I recommend to anyone interested in this particular topic is a book called Tapering for Peak Performance by Inigo Mujica. It's a fantastic book that covers this topic. And in fact, that more detailed definition is where I pulled that from. This is also a summary from Mujica's work. And so, if we're going to talk about reducing workloads, about how much, about how long, it depends. And I would say it depends on the athlete, the sport, how long that athlete's been training, how close to their genetic ceiling are they, how stable are their adaptations, which is a really important part of this. And I would say that a good way to look at it is, if you have a really well, highly trained, highly developed athlete, you can do a more aggressive taper, which would be a larger reduction. And so, for example, for my weightlifters, if I have a beginner, they've only been training for a year or two, the taper is very moderate, and it might just be a week of really going lower volume. If it's a real advanced athlete, it could be almost a month or up to a month, where we sort of systematically, progressively reduce the volume, and we'll do things like maybe take out back squats or some things that when we talk about fitness and fatigue, I think it'll make more sense in that the more advanced athlete has more stable adaptations. And so you can kind of take advantage of that with your tapering and peaking strategy. I'm not going to read this abstract, but I highly recommend this paper. It involved looking at actual competition data, track and field data from the Diamond League. And basically what they found, to generally summarize it, they found that at the most important events, people perform better, the athletes perform better. At the most important events, it's more important that they have a peak, that they peak, that they have a performance that is either a PR or a personal record, personal best, or very close to a personal best, and that if they want to medal, and that the top three tend to experience greater, so the medalists tend to experience greater peaks than the other competitors. And so certainly there's a whole bunch of things probably involved in how that works, but I think it's a safe bet that their training has a lot to do with it. I think a helpful way to think through training and athletes' responses to training is this idea of characteristic and idiosyncratic. This is stealing from Dr. Bill Sands, but essentially it's this idea, and it comes out of psychology many years ago, where they would look at they would take subjects, and they would do things like they blindfold them, and they would excuse me, like dunk their hand in cold water, and they would measure things, brain, cardiovascular, and what they would find is each individual subject would respond slightly differently than other subjects. If you were talking about like the very detailed quantitative or idiosyncratic response, but the general or qualitative or characteristic response, there's several words that are the same, would be the same. And so, in other words, when we're thinking through our periodization training plan, our periodized training plan, we don't, if we plan things out well and have clear sort of emphasis, de-emphasis approach to training, where we have phases and blocks within those phases with specific goals, and the training, the programming is put together in a way that sort of attacks those goals, we shouldn't be surprised where the majority of the adaptations occur. So in other words, just to give an example, if we have a maximal strength block of training that we have an athlete do, to where we emphasize maximal strength development and we de-emphasize other adaptations, we can still be developing them some or hitting on them some, but it's not the primary emphasis. If, let's say arbitrary example, 80% of the overall training stress is maximal strength. Maximal strength, we should be able to predict in a qualitative or characteristic manner. That will be where the majority of the adaptation occurs. We can predict that. Now, having said that, being able to predict exactly what the maximal strength gain will be, we can't do that, right? That's why we need to measure, and we have to carry out the training to then see what happened. And I would point out that it's not just the individual differences aren't just from athlete to athlete. If you take the same athlete and take them through the exact same training program multiple times, every time we should be able to predict the characteristic qualitative, assuming things don't really get off the rails, the exact, the magnitude, the quantitative response of in terms of adaptation, we won't know until they do it, because they'll very likely respond slightly differently to the training each time they do it, even though it's the same training. I think that it's important when we're thinking about tapering and peaking, as coaches, it's so easy to immediately jump to the actual sport results or the actual sport performance. And it makes a whole lot of sense why we would be concerned with that. But I think that, one, different sports are either easier or more difficult to sort of make that direct connection. So, for example, individual sports, it's much easier to do that, especially, I should say, individual measured sports, linking sort of the changes in the athlete's physiology over the course of a given training program, and their fatigue and their fitness and all of those things. And in team sport, it's really complicated. But I think the best way to think about monitoring over the long term, and the best way to think about how ready is our athlete to compete, a lot of that should be focused, not in everything entirely, but a lot of it should be focused on that term preparedness. And preparedness is the difference between fitness and fatigue. And we should view fitness not simply as like a lot of people just think, at least in the United States, like aerobic fitness, but fitness is essentially, it's just all of the important adaptations for an athlete for a particular sport. So it could be strength, power, speed, and different types of endurance. And then fatigue is just this general sort of negative training response. So fitness is a positive training response, fatigue is a negative training response. And the fatigue, and you see it better here, the fatigue sort of cancels out or disrupts, gets in the way, impedes fitness. And so this is an important concept for tapering and peaking, in that, so we do that build the engine training back in the general and the specific preparation. And then when we start our taper and peak, when we reduce the workload, fitness will hang in there for it. It really depends on what the adaptations are and the background of the athlete, but a pretty well trained athlete, it can be many weeks. And as fatigue dissipates due to the reduction of workload, and fatigue will dissipate at a much faster rate than fitness. I think this is too general of a statement, but the many textbooks, S&C textbooks will say like a rate of 3 to 1. And so if preparedness is the difference between fitness and fatigue, as fatigue dissipates and fitness hangs in there, as there's less fatigue to mask fitness, preparedness goes up. And as preparedness goes up, we can view that as performance potential. Elevated preparedness doesn't guarantee a personal best or a great performance, but the athlete is in a better state to express their adaptations. They're more likely to do well. And so, as coaches, like especially for measured sports, we're certainly looking at the actual sport as we're leading into a competition. But conceptually, I think this is a really helpful paradigm that allows us to plan out, how are we going to reduce our volume? What would be the periodized strategy to that? What would be the programming that goes within that? And like I mentioned before, at more advanced athletes, you can have more aggressive tapers or longer drawn out or larger reductions. One, because they do more work, right? That's part of accruing adaptations over time. 80% of 1 RM, for example, for a really strong, well-trained person is a whole lot greater absolute load than a weaker athlete. And a big benefit that better trained athletes have is that they have more stable adaptations. And so that means that when you get away from training something as much, the adaptation, the residual of that adaptation is greater. So it hangs around for much longer. I mentioned that I'm a weightlifting coach, and that example of a sort of a beginner versus a more advanced, the 1 week to almost a month taper. In the beginner, if we tapered for a month, their strength and power abilities would probably be reduced some, because their strength based adaptations aren't as stable. Real quickly, just a couple more slides. I wanted to mention sort of levels of monitoring using some typical periodization jargon with the micro, meso, and macro, as I think it helps maybe hopefully frame some of how to think about how we might have a monitoring strategy for our athletes. And so if we're interested in athlete monitoring, I think a very helpful way to think through monitoring is we have two types of monitoring. We have program efficacy, which is sort of this big picture, what I would say is macro level monitoring, where pick the important adaptations for the sport, and are we steadily improving those over a given period of time. And then we have fatigue management. So that gets into the more day-to-day. But for the macro level, here are two examples that I think are good ones, in that, if you're talking about a power-based athlete, maximal strength is really important. If we're talking about an endurance athlete, VO2 max is really important. Neither of these both these adaptations are important, but neither of them are really sensitive to fatigue. And I mentioned that, better trained athletes have more stable adaptations. Another part to the stability of an adaptation is what is the adaptation and what is the nature of the adaptation. Both of these adaptation examples are stable. In other words, athletes can be pretty fatigued and these things don't change much. And so one, they're not good markers of fatigue. And then the other thing is, especially in trained athletes, it's not, we train for 2 or 3 weeks and we bump them up a lot. It takes a long period of time. And so it's important because they're important adaptations, to monitor and measure them every now and then, but they're not something we need to measure all of the time. The more what we'll call meso level monitoring, deals with monitoring at sort of this level of within a given phase or block. And so I mentioned that thing of general and specific, or the qualitative versus quantitative, where we can qualitatively predict, due to our training and what it is, what the athlete is going to experience in terms of their adaptations. Essentially, where are the majority of the adaptations going to be accrued? And we can, with meso level monitoring, we can assess the athlete through, let's say, a battery of performance assessment, and we view that data through the lens of that qualitative prediction. In other words, what are we trying to bring about with this athlete? How should they be responding to their training at the moment over the last several weeks or months? And we should view and contextualize the data through that lens. And in other words, if we're in the general preparation and the athlete is maybe has some neuromuscular fatigue, their rate of force development is compromised, we shouldn't be concerned, because okay, they're fatigued, but that should be expected and in fact desired because of what their training is, versus if we're in a tapering and peaking phase, we would not want to see those things. And so I think it's important to sort of how you view the data be based on what training they're doing. And for more developed, more advanced athletes, what we tend to find is their responses to training become much more specific. In other words, this is maybe too easy of an example, but if you take someone that's not well strength developed, not well strength trained, and you get them, you focus on strength development for several months, you can improve all different types of strength. So rate of force development, peak force, relative strength, all of these things, to where in a more advanced athlete, we tend to find that their responses are more specific. So you work on maximal strength with them, and we'll find something like rate of force development or their explosive strength capabilities compromised. And so I think that's important, not just in terms of how you view monitoring, which it is, but then also when you're thinking through training, more advanced athletes probably need a more concentrated dose of training. So in other words, a greater amount of the emphasis, to where a beginner or close to a beginner or intermediate can have not completely mixed methods approach. They still probably should have de-emphasis, but the emphasis can be a little bit less and the de-emphasis can be a little bit more. And then just finishing up here, the micro level monitoring, like I mentioned, is really the more sort of day in and day out, and it's really aimed at fatigue monitoring. And I think it's important, again, that we put that fatigue monitoring through the lens of the training and contextualize it through that. So in other words, I think sometimes I see here coaches, excuse me, get too wrapped up in, are their athletes fatigued or not, without starting with, should they be fatigued or not based on the training plan. And then the other important aspect to the micro level monitoring is really tracking everything the athlete is doing in training. So it could be the sport, it could be the weight room, it could be the track and conditioning, whatever it may be. And that allows you to look at what's their volume intensity. There's some basic things with periodized plan where you want volume to be higher in the journal preparation, for example, lower in the transmutation, more specific training, and then lower in the competition, and especially lower in the taper and peak. And so if you don't have that information, manipulating it is difficult to impossible. And then just lastly, I think it's important to sort of connect the dots between the micro and the macro, in that one, if we're doing macro level monitoring, which I think is probably, at least here, the most common, and the best way to picture that is like maybe once or twice a year athletes do a battery of tests, strength test, power test, endurance test, what have you. That's good to do for sure, but it's really important to know, okay, these were the changes in this athlete from over 6 months or over a year, but to also then know this was the training that they did to bring about those changes. And so we kind of connect the dots. And then lastly, this micro level monitoring, it's micro because it's day in and day out tracking and recording, but the micro level monitoring can become, as it accumulates and accrues over time, macro level monitoring, in that as athletes train, we often use relative intensity, so percentage-based training. And so even if you have some similar training methods from one year to the next, which would make some sense, the cyclical nature of training, every time we go back to general prep, we're going to do higher volume in certain types of things, maybe similar set rep schemes one year to the next. As they're developing, even if you're doing, week one's 80%, week two's 90%, week three's 100%, if you do that year in and year out, while it might be the same relative volume or very similar relative volume and relative intensity, as they develop and as you sort of look at the training with this 1,000-foot lens, their absolute volumes and absolute intensity should be climbing over time. And so that's just one example of the micro feeding into the macro. And so with that, I hope I've stayed about where I needed to in terms of time. Thank you again for having me. I'm actually gonna step out and go to the gym so I can coach some, but Dr. Pierce said he would let me know if and when there's a discussion at the end. I'm happy to take questions now, depending on if John wants to do that or if he wants to wait. If you want to wait, John, till all three are done. But this is my email, my contact info, and then I'm on social media and all that as well. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hopefully being able to do some more of these with you.
Thank you, Guy. maybe you can take questions now. I can ask the participants if there's anyone with a question for you.
Okay.
Come up. Swali.
Thank you for the presentation. So mine is more of a comment than a question. With regards to monitoring. I just wanted to emphasize from your presentation that knowing your baselines is very important, because then we are monitoring, but you can only monitor when you know where you've started from. So there should be an emphasis on knowing the baseline of the athletes that we work with.
For sure. One of the things that we try to emphasize with the teams that we work with here is really two things related to that. One is, ideally, when it comes to performance testing, right when they come back to campus, we test them. And sometimes there's logistical challenges with that. It tends to be more difficult with teams that jump right into in season, camps and practicing all the time. The other thing too is, I think some sports scientists will argue over that word baseline, in that if athletes are training all the time, how do you really get a baseline? I think a good way to view that is if you make serial measurements. If you're pretty consistent with every phase or every couple months, and there's certainly it might be worthwhile, like every couple months doing a more full battery, and then within that a smaller battery, quicker tests and measurements. But if you do that over time, that can be helpful to sort of reduce some of the noise, so to speak, in that if let's say an athlete had just undergone a whole bunch of hard training, and we'll find that over the summer with some of our athletes that actually do these summer leagues, like soccer, for example, baseball, for example. And so they'll show up to campus pretty fatigued and having done a whole lot of competing and not a whole lot of quality training. And so we still want to measure them as quick as we can, but at the same time, when they show up fatigued, that might not be the best representation of sort of their true baseline. And so if you make serial measurements, you can kind of look at the averages, so to speak, and sort of see how they fluctuate up and down from there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Any other person with any other clarification or question? Anything that you need clarified? No one has anything to be clarified on tapering and monitoring? All right. Maybe if somebody has any question, we'll bring it up later.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah.